each time we come back to this conversation, we focus on a different topic. So this time we're actually exploring on permaculture and mental health. Next time we come back together, we'll be exploring permaculture and art. And following that, we'll be exploring permaculture from a children's perspective and a parent perspective. So please feel free at any time to drop in a suggestion of a theme to explore. So thank you for being part of this session. I'm just doing the double thing of hosting and taking at the same time. So if I look slightly distracted, that's what's going on. I'd like to welcome the people who you see on the screen here who have volunteered to be our presenters for today. Not necessarily presenters, but catalysts for conversation, reflectors on what's going on, or presenters, all of those and above and much more. But before I do, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm calling in from the unceded lands of the Gubbi Gubbi and pay my respects to elders, past, present, and emerging. And I welcome and encourage you to drop into the chat your acknowledgement and recognition of where you're seated and joining in today from. So thank you, and lovely to see you all here. The first question that I wanted to pass over to our panelists here today is, what for you is the connection between mental health and permaculture? And why do you think it's important to be exploring this topic? So we have with us Lizzy Smith, who's normally from the Canberra region, but is currently in Monto. We have Julian Hodgson, who's calling in from northern Sydney, and Sharon Pitman, who's also calling in from the Sydney region, and Julian, who's calling in from Melbourne. So welcome to you all, and thank you so much for agreeing to be part of this discussion, exploring and pulling apart what is the relationship between mental health and permaculture. Just before I open up to you as well, I just wanted to mention that during pandemic lockdowns, and particularly in Melbourne, because it was one of the biggest lockdowns in the world, Sustain Australia, who focuses on permaculture as well as urban agriculture, did a study, and the study was showing that gardening was particularly important for mental health. One of the statistics that they collected in their broad study they did during the time was that 20% of people said they couldn't get through the lockdowns without gardening. And they collected so many stories as well, talking about how there was one guy who had PTSD from being a firefighter not that long before the lockdown started, and described gardening as being a balm for my soul. And so I'm going to share with you in the chat too the link to that report if anyone wants to dive in more deeply. There's a lot of fantastic stories and evidence, and the report itself has so many different dimensions, well, that I think is really helpful to read. Feel free to use the chat, anyone too, if you would like to drop in any evidence or books or references or links or organizations that you know of. And we'll be saving and sharing the chat as well, so that you can use that as a reference. Don't feel like you have to write down everything. You'll get a copy of it after too. So please feel free to use that. I wanted to say peas. Mine's in the garden already. So look, yeah, over to you, to the panel. Anyone feel free to jump in first, and in that response of what is for you the connection between permaculture and mental health?
I'm happy to go first if no one else wants to. Hi everyone, my name is Jordan Hodgson, pronouns are he, him. As Morag said, I'm on Darug country in Sydney. I run Candle Hill Permaculture. It's a social enterprise that's supporting charities for a regenerative future. And that includes Morag's Ethos Foundation, which is a wonderful charity. I'm a mental health advocate and a graduate of the Educators Program with the Permaculture Education Institute. And this topic, mental health, is one that's very much close to my heart. As someone who's been heavily involved in the climate movement and social justice campaigning over the years, I've seen the toll that these issues can have on people's mental well-being, and of course the pandemic and everything that we've lived through in recent times. I guess, mental health has some stigmas around it, but like our physical health, mental health can be expressed on a continuum that ranges from good to poor or healthy to illness. And I think that's really important to acknowledge, that everyone falls somewhere along this line. And our position on that continuum can shift and change over time. And mental health becomes a serious problem when it gets stuck at the poor end of that continuum. And interestingly, or a not so fun fact, is that in any given year, 1 in 5 Australians will experience a mental health illness, yet only 1 in 2 who have a common mental health illness will seek professional help. So that's quite a staggering statistic. But I think the old adage, which is prevention is better than the cure, I might even update that to say that prevention and intervention is better than the cure. There are some strategies that we can employ to try and regulate our mental well-being for others and ourselves and people in our lives. And for me, permaculture is one of those strategies. Self-care is an essential tool for staying mentally healthy in the face of stress and life changes and traumatic events. And self-care, one of the things that permaculture offers for me is getting outside, connecting with nature, putting my hands in the soil. All those things I found to be incredibly restorative and regenerative for my mental health. And that's backed up with science too. So there's research to support the idea that gardening and working with soil can have a positive effect on mental health. And as Morag mentioned, Sustain have done some really, really valuable research in that area. And there's even evidence to suggest that certain bacteria found in soil can enhance the immune system, alleviate symptoms of depression and anxiety. So that's all really powerful stuff, and permaculture is powerful stuff. So that's why, permaculture is a key part of my mental health and self-care toolkit.
Thank you so much, Jordan, for sharing that and opening the conversation. I wonder if someone would like to jump in and follow on from what Jordan just articulated. Lizzy, go ahead.
Oh, Sharon, you go ahead.
Is that okay?
Sharon.
Sorry. I was just going to say, Jordan, you articulated that so well. I feel a little bit intimidated, but I'm going to do it anyway. I'm going to jump on you. I am an accredited mental health social worker, so I work in the trauma space and have worked in that profession since about 2006. The pointy end of mental illness, I suppose, mental health and well-being. And I've had my own personal journey as well. And I just to give you a bit of context, very passionate about education around mental health and mental illness and how to support loved ones and ourselves in that space. And I do present mental health first aid and have done around Australia. And am very passionate about that. So I'm going to throw in a personal story. I'm brand new kid on the block, so I'm just having a go here. End of June last year, I hit a wall personally, and had to take a massive burnout. People call it compassion fatigue, whatever you like. had to take a major back step when it came to my work. And I went down the path of counselling, and, you know, it's kind of ironic that I did have counselling, but I actually found, as my own personal experience, getting out in the garden was the therapy that I needed. So I spent, you know, 6 months in the garden pretty much every day. And I've been on this sort of permaculture journey, nutrition, health and wellness, holistic health, all that kind of stuff that, you know, the words get thrown around a lot, and people have their own interpretations of what that means. But I went into the garden and spent 6 months literally spending hours and hours and hours. And I feel better. So for what that, you know, for what that's worth, I do believe there's a place for counselling, obviously. It's my industry, so, you know. But I also think that as a way of nurturing our souls, of, you know, even the interaction between, and further on from what Jordan said in relation to getting our hands in the dirt, and nutritionally, it helps our microbiome in our gut. I mean, how amazing is nature and humanity, and how we interact, and we're all so closely connected, aren't we? So that's my story, and I hope it encourages you. There's a whole lot of evidence and science to support this, and, you know, that's absolutely true. But I think when we have a personal story as well, it can be very inspirational. And for someone such as myself, who works in the trauma space, I work with victims of crime and people that have experienced horrendous things in their lives. And being able to hold myself is critically important. And being in the garden is my space. That's what rejuvenates me and keeps me, or helps me heal and keeps me strong. So there you go. That's my bit.
Thank you so much for sharing that. Oh gosh, you know, there's something, what both of you have said, you know, resonates so deeply. And I also, you know, I think that sharing of a story, the personal story, makes it okay to also talk about, you know, the possibilities or the experiences that we're having or we've had. And also points to possibly some of the ways in which we can step up differently in the permaculture community, or just in community, to find ways to create a more nurturing space for people, for family, for friends, for ourselves. As you both said, the self-care part of it is huge, so that you can continue to contribute, whether it be as a climate activist or as a supporter of other people with issues in their lives. So yeah, thanks, Sharon. Lizzy, did you want to jump in there, because you were, yeah.
Okay. Hello everyone, I'm Lizzy Smith. I usually live in the Canberra region in Queanbeyan. As Morag said, I'm up here visiting family, which is lovely. I should just pardon if anyone walks through the room. So I guess I was first, I totally agree that the dynamic nature of mental health is really important to recognise. No one can be fully happy, optimistic all the time. It's quite exhausting to try to be. So that's a lesson I've learned in my decades. But I think I first came to the concepts of mental health, not really appreciating it, when I first moved out of home, went to uni, sort of got halfway through uni and started to struggle just in the whole, you know, what am I here for? What am I doing in my late teens, early 20s? And yeah, went to the student counsellor then in the day. and yeah, got some support from that, but mainly it was just talking through with my friends and just deciding what inside me did I actually enjoy and want to do, respond to, and just taking that reflective approach. And through that, I actually realised I enjoyed doing the course I was doing, and then worked in rehabilitation, like physical rehabilitation centres, people with acquired brain injury, and a lot of, therapy from a physiotherapy point of view, but also worked with rehab teams, social workers, OTs. And gardening in that day was a very big occupational therapy for people who spent a long time recovering. It's not so much the case these days, with better intervention and medicine to reduce the damage. But certainly people with strokes, but also saw, when I worked with terminally ill people in the sort of palliative stage, the solace the carers found from their environment. And often that included greenery in the house, greenery in the bedroom for the person who could no longer move or could barely breathe. So it really saw, for me, that connection. But it's also been reinforced from my upbringing, growing up on a farm, understanding, going for long walks along the creek to get away from, large families and things like that. So been a big part of my life. So I think I was going to show the permaculture flower, Morag, if I can share screen.
Yeah. Oh,
Because I think that positions well-being, as I tend to approach mental health from, quite well within permaculture. Can I show now? I'll give it a go, see what happens. Giving it a go might be a theme for the day. Okay. So hopefully you can see that to some degree anyway.
yeah, we can.
Yeah, so this is something I talk to quite a lot when I do introductions to permaculture, and people have really responded well at festivals, having this as a key point of a talk. And these are the domains, the little petals all around here are the domains of permaculture. So you can see how comprehensive, how holistic permaculture as a design framework is, and what it covers. And this red thing here is really intended to represent this going from self, so from me, to we, to us. So that broadening circle of care and interaction and connection, as we move out from, in this context, self-care into perhaps care of loved ones, and then perhaps care of community as well. So health and spiritual well-being, as it's called in this permaculture flower petal, is comprehensive, but you can see that it's closely affiliated with, financial and economics and education and culture as well. So these are the things that will interact with it, as you can see, but it's really central to this ethics-based approach. I'll stop sharing there. And for me, I think I would have appreciated having this framework in my life as I had children, went through postnatal depression, got through that, and then worked in quite demanding jobs. And just to have that holistic frame of reference was important. And I think I came to more formal studies in positive psychology, so looking truly and deeply at well-being, and how to apply that in work design. And that's where I work as a professional as well. So really now applying those concepts, which I saw very much mirrored in the design of permaculture, and that positive activism, or practivism, as practical activism, as you term it, Morag, really giving people positive incentive and not so much reward, but positive feedback in taking a step, having a go, giving it a crack. Yeah, so I think they're the key points I'd make for now. But I think permaculture principles and positive psychology principles, creating work environments where people can thrive and be nourished by whatever they're doing together, is certainly something I take into my profession, and it's a great lens for difficult problems within community, and it's a good starting lens for starting startups, enterprises. Was trying to start a farming cooperative here in the Canberra region, and we're using those principles, and that leads you into a very regenerative, nourishing culture.
Thank you so much, Lizzy. And thanks for bringing in the flower and reminding us all of, you know, the multiple domains of permaculture. Often, you know, we get caught on permaculture being, you know, a particular thing, whereas it's a way of seeing, and it does have, you know, it's that field of, from, you know, the personal to the professional, as you've been talking about, applying it to community. So yeah, thank you so much, and also for sharing your personal story as well. You know, I would hazard to say there's probably no one in this room who's not also experienced some struggle at some time, and maybe multiple times. You know, I know I have, and it always, you know, coming back and circling back around into being in the garden and connecting with community and finding those ways of restoring. And, you know, I giggled when you said walking down the creek, because I've done that quite a lot of time. You know, you find those peaceful places and spaces to nourish yourself, and being mindful of these things. And then how can we consciously bring that into our work that we're doing with permaculture? We're designing our gardens, like, where are those nourishing spaces within it? Or we're designing a community farm, what are the processes and the places that can help to nourish people and the community as a whole, of the culture? I think that's really important too. It's like nourishing self, but nourishing the culture that supports well-being. So yeah, thanks so much everyone's brought to the conversation so far. Thank you. So over to you, John. I wonder whether you wanted to add some response to what you've heard already, or just something different that you wanted to bring in.
Thank you. I've been adapting what I was going to say as everybody's spoken, crossing things off the list. I still have some other things. Jordan was right that it is, now, my name's John Julian. I've spent the last, up until 2019 I spent about close to 2 decades as a senior trainer in mental health in Victoria. I've been a clinical social worker for 45 years. I nearly burnt out at one stage, but got through it. I, as a child, had 6 or more adverse childhood events. And the reason I got through those was after the age of 9, I had access to nature, gardening, and yoga, which was fascinating. And a book called On the Razor's Edge by Somerset Maugham that was given to me, which was fascinating. So I've been around for a while. My interest in permaculture started at around the same time I got into social work. Jordan's one in that you know, 20% of people are going to be affected by mental illness in any one year is accurate. But the figures are, in the life of a community, 47.9% of the population will be directly affected by substance abuse, depression, or anxiety. And that's not including the people who are affected by the person who has those conditions. It's much bigger in our communities than we give credit for. And, you know, I've been a very successful therapist for many people, not all, but many people over the years. These days, I expect them to go walking, to spend a minimum of 2 hours in nature every week before I'm even willing to consider taking them on as a person to assist and work with in their life. In the last 20 years as a senior clinician, I was mostly training staff in mindfulness, and I also was involved in the third world studies of mindfulness in the early 2000s, and we introduced that to Victoria and to many mental health staff. I also introduced mindful self-compassion into Australia in 2014. So I've tried to radicalise those people I could by being underhanded in a senior position. But I'll never ever agree I said that here if anybody quotes me, okay? I worked deliberately with transdiagnostic methods because I don't really believe diagnosis is a really good way to go. I got on top of my own anxiety through mindfulness and permaculture, and I got it to levels that were acceptable to me, which are getting lower and lower as I get older. I, though, have major concerns which permaculture fits into. One is industrialisation and the chemicalisation of the planet and agriculture. We have a good scientific evidence base developing, not fully funded, but developing, that ultra-processed foods will create an increase of by 30% in anxiety and depression, and also increase the issues surrounding attention ADHD. Secondly, the development of modern society, which includes any industrialised society, has destroyed our kinship networks and extended families, because the nuclear family is a better target to purchase consumer goods. And it's not normal for a mother to be in a household raising 1, 2, or 3 children or more by herself. That is a crazy system. It's the system that is crazy, not necessarily the people. You know, when I first got into mental health, the job I had to do was to get people off Valium that they were put on during the 60s by doctors left, right and centre, because they couldn't handle being in a brick veneer house in the suburbs, which I thought was a pretty sane response. That they couldn't handle it. And a couple of things happened back then was the development of neighbourhood houses and things like that, but they were band-aids. So I have major problems around those things, and I see permaculture as a way in which we get back to nature, back to gardening, back to healthy food. And what I found is that permaculture, even though I'm only just put in my first assignment, everybody, I'm a real rank beginner formally, but I've had 3 or 4 permaculture gardens since the 70s, like, you know, let's say they're semi-permaculture. Don't want to be. So basically, I see permaculture as helping ecologies to be flexible, adaptive, cohesive, energetically balanced and stable, so that they can put up with change. And that is also the basis for human well-being. So by starting to do those, you're modelling it and starting to apply it to your local ecology, and that rubs off on yourself as well. I nearly started this course on the 1st of January this year, but I put it off because we had another thing that I'd been working on with the person I mentor. And that's a 9-week course called Mindfully Enhancing Your Relationship to Nature and Health, Myrna. And the topics look really nice and polite, And I go in and Joe goes in as well, and we savage industrialism and agricultural food, which puts out 220 billion tonnes of chemicals every year, many of them permanent, so that we have trillions of tonnes of chemicals hanging around the planet now, which would take 130 years of every laboratory working 24/7, 130 years to find out what the hell they're doing. And we're still putting it out in an uncontrolled way. The sperm count of males has reduced by 50 to 60% since the 1970s. So the problem may be answered reasonably sooner than we think. But I hope not. So we've done 2 runs of our course so far, Myrna, and we've had 20 to 30% reductions in reported behavioural issues around mental health. Just in our, well, we use some fairly formal questionnaires. So we're looking at taking that forward in the future. So yeah, and that's how everything works for me around permaculture. I currently have 2 or 3 acre property with permaculture. The other project I delayed starting the course is because I've now got a studio that people can come and stay in. Yeah. So thank you for that.
John, thank you. And, you know, these studies that you're talking about, I wonder whether you've got any links to these, particularly around the impact of industrialized food on...
Yeah, we've got quite a few articles that I can send you to send out to everybody. I'll just need to get to the right parts of the manual and pull them out.
Yeah,
and
that would
most,
yeah.
There was an interesting one put out by one of our local Melbourne universities. It was Deakin or RMIT or Swinburne, I can't remember which, called Smiles. And that was done about 10 years ago, where they got people off processed food and onto a actually very conservative Mediterranean diet. It wasn't, you know, that great. And they had a 30% reduction in depression and anxiety rates as well. And that's a decade old, but it just doesn't get out there, because if you check out the nutritionist associations around the world, they will have at least one global company sponsoring them.
That's true.
Yeah. The industrial sponsoring, corporate sponsoring of universities is also, you know, it's a major problem. I mean, even my daughter's just studying at ANU now, and she said they're the least corporate sponsored university in Australia, but yet it was still about half of the sponsoring coming from corporates. You know, the information that we need to be researching is not. So independent researching of this and independent exploration of this work is so important. But, you know, you've touched on...
We were actually shocked when we looked at the research, because we researched heavily for this course. And I've been aware of these things for 20 years, 25, 30 years, but I couldn't believe the material we were able to come up with. It was just, it was pretty shocking. Yeah.
It is. It's absolutely shocking. And why this is not front page news just absolutely befuddles me. You know, what you've just articulated there, John, is that you've got the 20% of people who are suffering directly from mental health, and then there's the 47.9%, I can't remember exactly the number, who are related to that. So that's, you know, that's a good major chunk of the population who every day...
No, it's actually 80% who are affected indirectly. There's a few yobos out there who drink too much and have skins of leather, and they don't think they're being affected at all. But
let's just say generally
47.9%, nearly half the population, will have a mental health directly in their life.
Yeah. And so,
sorry, can you just clarify that, John? You just said they'd have a mental health, a
Mental illness issue.
episode. I just want to check that, because we often use mental health and mean mental illness.
Yeah,
And
that's right. You're right.
it really
It's a crazy way of
diminishes,
doing it.
yeah, the potential that we all have to flourish and be on a, on that stable point of our lives.
Yeah.
Mentally.
Like a person can be mentally ill and have a high level of well-being.
Exactly.
Yeah, they don't rule each other out. Yeah. Yeah.
And
Sorry.
everybody has mental health.
Everybody.
We're all on that spectrum somewhere, all on that continuum. And I think, that changing of the language is very, very important. Can I just mention a little something? I love having a fellow social worker in the space. I would like to say that I think social work and permaculture are such a beautiful connection, because that systemic approach that we're trained in it's just so holistic and such a critical part of the way we should all be thinking. But I don't know if anybody else has been listening to the Food Revolution Network summit that's currently on at the moment. Yesterday or the day before, they did a massive, a whole day presentation on mental health. And it was just super, super encouraging. And I don't want to, if I'm deviating, please pull me into line, Morag. But the whole idea of food and, whole foods and the medical profession. When I started, I sort of became aware of this in the last probably 10 years ago. There was so much, it just wasn't medical people didn't want to accept that food and diet was so critically important to a person's well-being. And yet now, listening to it was just such a breath of fresh air. And that whole idea of being able to grow our own food and know what we're eating and what we're putting into our bodies for our mental health and well-being is just so, it's a deal breaker, really. And I really hope that we continue on this path of realization and that the medical profession do really jump on board in a much, much bigger way, as we're seeing beginning to happen, because it's a critical key towards our humanity surviving, I believe, and flourishing.
And that just sort of adds more to what I was going to say before about why is this not more out there in everyday news about the impact, and how is it that we can, with the knowledge and the experience, maybe it's through the personal story sharing, that we actually articulate that very clearly and be consciously putting out stories into the world about this. We can share the facts, we can share the figures, and like you're saying, Lizzy, you hear mental health this, mental health that, but how does it land with people? And when each one of you have shared a bit of your story, and people have been watching the chat going, yes, I relate to that resonates with me. It's when this story is shared and it becomes like a personal conversation, it changes the way it lands in us. And I think also weaving together the personal and the political. Often I've heard people say, let's not get political in permaculture. I actually think we need to be using as a platform to really craft change that we want to see in the world, because as John was saying there too about, the industrial food, if it's not that, then what? Let's have a look. How can permaculture describe a different way of thinking, a different way of designing, a different way of growing food, a different way of connecting? All of that, we can use it as a lens to connect with people around the world, bring in the experience that we have and share it out in the world. But what I would love to drop around, maybe go around again and maybe Jordan, if you wanted to jump in again to start this conversation, or not, anyone. But how do you see the possibilities of amplifying this further, in whether it be in your work or your communities, this notion of how permaculture can step up to support mental health, mental well-being? In what ways can permaculture education or design support that process? I don't think I asked the question very well. Sorry, I had lots of different questions in my mind, but I think you get the point. How can we step up? You've got 3 ways.
Yeah, I'm happy to talk just to start it off. There is an area that we totally ignore because it doesn't fit with industrialism, and it's totally ignored in mental health, in attachment theory, and that is attachment to place. And attachment to place has been fully destroyed with industrialisation in creating a workforce that can fly in and fly out, because we don't want people attached to an area, because that also creates problems. So getting people to become attached to a place in nature or in a garden or things like that can really start to improve their health and start to revolutionise things. Now, I have no evidence for saying that, because it's not been raised anywhere else in the world until now, that we are missing attachment to place, and that this is ignored totally in attachment theory that was developed after World War II. So there's that. Secondly, we need to lobby for access to parks and gardens and community gardens in local council areas and in the design of all new regional and urban areas, very much as the Scottish have done. A principle: you need to be able to walk to a park no matter where you live. Pretty simple. We argue for a principle to be adapted and adopted. And thirdly, we teach everybody to make seed bombs, following that great Japanese gardener, and throw them everywhere. Pumpkins with beans and all sorts of things.
Thank you. I'm just going to jump in there, because this attachment to place, gosh, it's so enormous. And I think too, the possibility of maybe there's not the research, but there's definitely stories and experience to share with that. And particularly if we focus on our conversations with Indigenous communities. But coming back to the community gardens, I was thinking, I started Northey Street City Farm when I was in my 20s, and I'd left Melbourne because of issues, let's just say that. And I landed in Brisbane, really didn't know anyone or anything about place or climate. And I found a small group of people and started this community garden. And it was the most profound experience of finding me in this place, in that community, and who I was and what I have to give in the world. And I found it there in the midst of this degraded piece of land that just needed some love. What I loved about that place too was the possibility of knowing that it was always going to be there. Like if my journey could take me somewhere else, I could always come back and land in that place. And I remember I went off and I traveled for quite some time, and I came back and I noticed how, this forest had grown where there was once just wasteland. And I cried as I walked through it. It's like just the love of that community space. Anyway, I think, yeah, attachment to place is enormous. And I also did write, the Brisbane City Council commissioned me a while ago probably 25 years ago now, to write a report for how urban agriculture could be woven through the fabric of the city. That was part of their metropolitan planning process. And that very principle was in there, that there was a walkable community garden in every neighbourhood. As a result of that, they employed community gardens officers, but we're still a very long way off that. I think that principle is essentially like a park, and a park, not just a park that you go to visit, but a park that you're engaged in, that you have that attachment of place with. It's different. It's so different. And just on the rewilding thing, I just noticed an article that came through this morning that one of the most important things that we could be doing at this time is rewilding the planet. And that will address so many different things, from, you know, climate to food and obviously our conversation here with mental health. So yes, rewild our places, rewild our urban spaces, rewild our parks, reduce our footprint to enable all life to flourish around the world.
Can
yeah,
I
go ahead, Lizzy.
not-
And then
not
we'll go
ask-
back across Jordan and Sharon. I don't know what order
Okay.
you're seeing it.
Yeah. I just want to pick up a few points about, just to broaden that perspective that John laid out there. There is some research on sense of place. I think by an Australian researcher, I can't remember. I think it was their doctorate research, but I remember reading the research about that. Obviously, our First Nations people, and I think that's a great entry point for those of us who aren't First Nations to start with, to appreciate knowing which country, which groups, mobs of First Nations people were and are in your region. I think just knowing that is important to be Australian, and I've certainly heard that called for by our local people. Just to understand your place is important for your health. Coming from Canberra, it's a design city. I can't remember if it was Gough Whitlam or Menzies, who in the design of some of the Canberra suburbs said children should be able to walk safely to school, not cross roads. So some of the northern suburbs were designed that way before the 90s economic rationalism of education closed some of the schools. But they would walk through parks to go to school. So these were very early concepts that people had, that some cities in the mad growth phases that we've been in have forgotten, and we're now remembering. And microforests are another example of that. And there's a whole movement in Canberra. If you watch Gardening Australia on Friday, you saw the Canberra microforest, and obviously we're trying to do similar in Queanbeyan to capitalise on our bare grass, a few gum trees, shade over the playground, sort of parks that we have for our children, and make those interesting educational spaces as well, that you can do the rewilding education with your kids. Just go out and they can, see what a dry creek bed is and understand that relationship that we have with water here in Australia and things like that. And I think the bioregionalism would be the third point I'd make. Very much something I'm interested in at the moment. What Joe Brewer is doing for that, Helena Norberg Hodgson as well, very strong advocates for really getting this sense of place in your bioregion, being that your climatic region really, and your community, whatever boundaries that might be. It might be mountains, it might be ocean, it might be river systems that create some sort of segment that you live in as well. So that's sort of the points I pick up on from what John was saying.
Thanks, Lizzy. Yeah, great points. Yeah, Jordan, go ahead.
Yeah, some really incredible things are being brought up here. There's a lot of that the whole idea of practivism really resonates with me. It's something that I choose to do rather than getting consumed by the the eco-anxiety of everything that's going on and all the problems in the world that we're facing. So taking action is really powerful. And I guess all of these ideas that we're talking about, something that we can all go away from today and think about and work on applying some of this and I guess taking the time to reflect on it would be really helpful, I think. Thinking about how we can use all these different strategies and ideas and apply it to our own family and personal situation. So one of the tools that I would recommend, and something that I have a bit of experience in, is journaling as a way of reflecting and tying it all together. And journaling about permaculture is something that we can all do. It's a reflective practice that involves writing about your experiences in nature, applying the permaculture principles, the domains and the ethics into your daily life and the things that you're seeing and observing, reflecting on the relationships that exist. And that can really help to ground us and empower us to take action. And I don't know if the others who are trained therapists have something to add about journaling as a technique, but there is research to back this up as well. We know that journaling improves mental health outcomes. It clearly helps with reducing symptoms of depression and anxiety, improving emotional regulation, and increasing our resilience. And I think that's the key word, is resilience. We use permaculture to improve the resilience of the systems around us and to work with nature. We also need to look at improving our self-resilience, and journaling can be a really powerful tool to help us with that.
Thanks, Jordan. Do you want to drop into the link to your journal, because you've actually crafted up a journal that you make available to people? Did you want to drop that into the link, show people that?
Yeah, sure. I'll drop it in now. So I also have a free guide for how to get started in permaculture journaling, and it dives in a little deeper than what I've just covered, how permaculture can be enhanced through a practice of journaling.
And those of you, well, you're all here as part of the Permaculture Educators Program. If you want to look back into the resources in the education lab, one of the recordings is of Jordan explaining in more detail his work. That was his presentation. He developed that up as part of his work. So yeah, thank you for bringing that, reminding us of that possibility of journaling, and also to say that next month when we have this conversation, it will be not just about art, but art and journaling as well. So it comes back in, it weaves its way back through a whole lot of things. So thanks, Jordan. Thanks a lot. Sharon, did you want to add to it? I can't believe it's almost like we haven't even asked anyone if anyone had any questions of the audience yet. Oh my gosh.
I'll only add two sort of light things. I think the word belonging is also a critical in the sense of place. And I think, in the sort of, in my mind, the attachment theory, that sense of belonging can come through people, but it also does come through place. It's not a huge leap to relate those two together. And, once again, personally, I have a creek across the road. I live in suburbia, and yet I'm near a heritage park, and it's just, going for a walk and seeing a family of ducklings, a family of ducks having a little paddle is just phenomenal. And I just feel so grateful and blessed. And being able to, moving from one place to another, the impact that it has is profound. And I think we do take that too lightly, that sort of transient lifestyle that a lot of people tend to adopt. And the journaling, Jordan, from my experience, I think I personally journal. I think it's incredible. I think it, dramatically improves at a therapeutic space. It increases self-awareness. I think it does depend in a mental health space, or, depending on what a person's facing, journaling can be too confronting sometimes. So that's therapeutically, but I do agree in being able to sort of bring our thoughts together and sort of create our own ethos, our own philosophy, our own understanding of the world, making sense of the world. It's a very powerful tool, which is something that I use myself. So thank you for the opportunity to be a part of this group. And that's all I have to say.
Well, thank you all for being part of this conversation here today. And I want to thank all of you who are here too, listening in and adding your comments and thoughts. And I do want to say that I'm sorry that I didn't make time for having question time in this session. But what a rich conversation here as part of the group that are here. Maybe if there's any questions that you're holding, the possibility of dropping them either here in the chat and we can bring them forward into our conversation in Hive, or maybe even host another conversation at another time where it is just everyone in conversation around it. So, let's explore multiple possibilities there. Yeah, great. Thank you so much for all the chat. I will drop in the recording and all of the comments here into Hive tomorrow. It'll be attached to the event. You'll find the recording and the link to the chat in this event. You have to go into sort of past events. I'll also drop it in the main feed so you'll be able to find it. Please encourage other people to come and drop in and have a listen to this. If you're here and you think, oh gosh, this is a conversation that would be great for other people to hear within the course, just, put in that encouragement there. So my deep gratitude to you all for being here this morning. Such a rich conversation. And I think to this question of how permaculture has affected your mental health, reflecting on that, how permaculture can support mental health is another really big question. And how can we open up more this conversation of the bigger picture around systemic change using a kind of permaculture lens to address mental health in our society globally, I think is so important.